Soviets were so satisfied with the Sputnik program that in 1962 they launched a top-secret project, sufficient moon base. The plan was codenamed Zvezda, or Star, was to take over the moon before the Americans. They were ambitious and called for the establishment of several habitation modules that would be had to conceal them. They would also be equipped with a wheeled chassis to reposition. Zvezda's development looked promising in the N1 human lunar expedition program. The powerful rocket of components to the moon began suffering a series of crucial setbacks, and it looked for on the market that could be up to the task. That is, until a prominent inventor came up with a potential solution. After the Berlin airlift of 1948, it became clear, especially in the United States, that there were insoluble differences between the ideas of a new world order. In the years following the rise in the Cold War, Americans and Russians clashed in the arms and space race, sought to conquer the moon and outer space. On par development, American and Soviet engineers commenced the development of ambitious plan Moon. While the Americans maintained nuclear supremacy, this rapidly gained the upper edge. During President Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1 in October of 1957, to be launched into space and the first to be put into orbit. It suffered a huge blow, and Eisenhower took the matter seriously. The President dissolved the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, or NACA, with medical research for the past decades, and created NASA. The Aeronautics and Space Act began to focus on the space race from that point onwards. During this time, Werner von Braun, the German developer of the V-2 rocket, led the space program, and 1 year after NASA's establishment, his group stages of a lunar military outpost for the U.S. Army, codenamed Project Horizon. The moon outpost was expected to cost and become operational by 1986. 12 soldiers entered the moon and the Earth from the outpost, which would also deter Soviet interest in the Saturn I and Saturn II rockets still under development to supply the base, and it was estimated that Horizon would require over 250 construction materials. The project was developed in extreme secrecy. People knew about the fundamental objective of landing on the moon. Kennedy assumed the presidency in 1961. He awarded more funds to NASA assets for the space race. The president publicly claimed that he was committed to landing a man on the moon within the decade, which was the Apollo program. However, the Soviet space program shared the same objective. Soviet crewed lunar programs like the Soyuz or Zon spacecraft missions launched for it. Like the Americans, it was feasible to establish a lunar base. And as far back as 1950, professors from the Soviet Academy of Sciences had expressed that a moon base could be a radar. In the early following cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin's success aboard Vostok 1, Sergei's brilliant mind behind the entire Soviet space program took on the project to potentially a moon surface. Korolev discussed the idea with several scholars in 1962 and even published an article in Pravda, the primary public party. However, the matter took a serious tone until when the Soviets were working on the powerful N1 rocket, and thanks to Korolev's K-bomb Design Bureau, began gathering information to establish a lunar base. The Bureau first contacted biologists, doctors, architects, atomic experts to study the project's feasibility. Then, in 19 K-bomb issued a report titled Principles of the Construction of Long-Functioning Lunar, which proposed building a lunar base in 3 phases. It would only be habitable for a crew of 4 at first, but would increase to 12 when the last built. It would have a common area, an astronomy lab, a power supply vehicle depot, and auxiliary facilities, and would also include life support, thermal control, communication systems, a gym, and a kitchen. The facilities would be buried under layers of regolith to conceal and protect them from meteor, and its total mass was estimated at 52,000 kilograms, which in one rocket. In 1970, building a full-scale mock-up of one of the lunar modules to test different technologies and Unfortunately, things didn't go as expected with the powerful N1 carry all the materials required to build the Soviet moon base. Several launch attempts, the N1 project was suspended in 1974, all of what had gone wrong, and the K-bomb Bureau was forced to stop the lunar base program that delivered results. Still, not all hope was lost for the base. The N1 program, the government appointed Valentin Glushko as the head of Energia, manufacturer and developer of Soviet spacecraft. He wished to terminate the N1 rocket. He was pleased to continue with the creation of a In 1974, Energia released a proposal that was codenamed Zvezda, or Star, and that would be delivered to the moon aboard the rocket. This rocket could deliver to low Earth, 60 tons to the moon's orbit, and 22 tons to the lunar payload would consist of the LEK, or Lunar Expeditionary Complex, craft. The LEK spacecraft consists of the moon's descent, the ascent stage for taking off from the lunar surface, and the returning to Earth. It weighed 31 tons and comprised a 20-ton module of 160 cubic meters, of which 25 square meters and 25 for laboratory usage. The model had a width of a little more than 8 meters. It was powered by a solar panel and electricity. The third complex was a 15 duction module that stood 5 meters tall and gave access to a biotechnology with a 3-ton oxygen-generating facility. The complex would be powered by a nuclear power unit. It was the last asset of the Zvezda moon base. The 8-ton vehicle would have a speed of 5 kilometers per hour and an approximate range of 200 kilometers. Before the deployment of the base, the desired zone would be meticulously lunar spacecraft. Afterward, the base would begin construction in 3, which the first 2 would require 5 Vulcan rocket launches to carry all the equipment. The last phase would take place 2 months after Phase 2, meaning laboratory equipment. Unfortunately, ambitious proposal did not convince the Soviet government. After notice not establish any moon bases during its 7 lunar Apollo expeditions, the government project. Instead, the Soviets put their focus on copying the footprint shuttle. The project was also abandoned because it would cost it less dollars in 1980s currency. However, the establish a moon base did not entirely go away, and in the late 2010s, Russia began gathering information to consider building a future base on the moon. The Lunokhod 1 made history as the first remote-controlled rover across the moon's surface. Also known as Moonwalker 1 or 203, this robotic lunar rover was developed as part of the Lunokhod program to support the Soviet human moon missions. Lunokhod 1 arrived at the moon aboard craft in November of 1970. Its innovative scientific material and information related to the moon's soil. There wasn't images and 200 high-fidelity panoramas back to Moscow. Designed originally with a lifespan of 3 lunar days, the equivalent of 90 days, but an astonishing career of 11 lunar days, almost an entire Earth year. One traveled 11 kilometers across the moon's rocky surface under a simultaneous 5-man. On September 14, 1971, on the anniversary, contact was abruptly lost with the vehicle. Failed attempts to reach it forced the Russian. 40 years later, in late 20s, French scientists conducting remote research on the moon were astonished by the discovery of It was the Lunokhod 1, and its signal was more powerful than the relic of the Cold War had made a strange comeback. Once the Soviet Union solidified its grip over most parts of Eastern Europe after the end of World War II began. By the early 1950s, the United States' nuclear and military stronghold faced a new competitor. It was the USSR again. For almost 3 decades, development rampage of military innovations whose sole objective was to overpower the enemy and shift. Closely related to this race was the ultimate display of full competition rose between both countries. It was called the space race, and it reached its height. The United States and the Soviet Union engaged in the moon as another way of displaying their tremendous technological developments. The Soviets had the upper edge due to the initially successful Vostok and Sputnik programs. This program. The USSR sent the first Gagarin in 1961 aboard the Vostok 1 capsule. The first 2- and 3-person spaceships were successful as well. The American space program evolved into NASA, which produced programs, among others. Their ultimate objective was not space. They sought to land him on the moon. In 1968, after the deadly launch pad explosion of the Zond rocket suspended all projects related to landing a man on the moon. The delay would be... In 1969, at the height of the Vietnam, Armstrong became the first human to walk on an Earth satellite. The U.S. was unanimously in the race. The moon belonged to the U.S., and it looked like there was nothing the Soviets could from stepping forward. But an ambitious project was under development that still had some tricks up its sleeves. It was named the Lunokhod program, and its goal, robot rovers on the moon. The Lunokhod, or Moonwalker program, was part of a series of Russian robotic lunar on the moon. The first prototype, Lunokhod 0, was launched in... It was destroyed during takeoff. The last prototype, Lunokhod 3, sometime in 1977, but it never came to be, and the project got suspended. The Lunokhods were designed to assist Soviet cosmonauts in their landings on the moon. Relation of the USSR's manned landings, they were redesigned to function as remote-controlled robot scientific research on the moon's surface. Lunokhods were transport spacecraft powered by Proton K rockets. The Luna 17 lander was launched successfully from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan on November 10, 1970. It made it to lunar orbit 5 days later and soft-landed in the flood basalt surface Sea of Rains on November 17th. Time magazine wrote about the robot's 3 hours after reaching the moon, aboard the latest unmanned Russian moon probe. Lunokhod 1 lumbered down one of 2 ramps extended by the mothership and moved, thus taking the first giant step for robot kind on another celestial body. NASA, genuinely intrigued by the curious Soviet vehicle, would also write about it in a summary. Lunokhod 1 was a lunar vehicle formed of a tub-like compartment with large independently powered wheels. Lunokhod was equipped with a cone-shaped antenna, a helical antenna, 4 television cameras, and special extendable devices to impact soil density and mechanical property tests. The rover ray detector, X-ray telescope, X-ray spectrometer, and a laser reflector device to measure the distance between the Earth and the Moon. Its body was filled with nitrogen at standard atmospheric pressure. The dome hinged at the rear to be used as an insulation layer for the 3-week lunar nights. The moon's extremely cold temperatures, the Lunokhod was kept warm by a radioisotope that generated. Multiple cameras on the rover were used by a 5-man crew to steer the vehicle in the desired direction. Driving was no easy task, slowly, meticulously studying the terrain to avoid losing communication with Earth or a 9th wheel, an odometer, was placed at the rover's rear to. The rover relied on thermal energy, radioisotope heater, to survive the night colds. When temperatures reached minus 150 degrees, the Lunokhod was solar-powered by day. Before conducting, the vehicle opened its lid to charge its batteries. Given that the moon always near Earth, daylight and nighttime hours on most spots of the surface last about 2 weeks. The rover was designed to last 3 lunar days, the equivalent of 90 Earth days. The Lunokhod exceeded the expectations of the USSR. It went on for 11 lunar days. The rover traveled 10.5 kilometers before contact was lost with Moscow in 1971, 14 years after the first Sputnik was launched. Reached it repeatedly, but failed to do so. The Lunokhod 1 was then forgotten in place. For 322 Earth days, almost a year, 20,000 TV pictures, 200 TV panoramas, and information from orbital tests to Moscow. 2010, 40 years after the Lunokhod 1 lost contact with Earth, it was found. A NASA press statement said, quote, on April 22nd, Murphy and his team sent pulses of laser light from the 3.5-meter telescope observatory in New Mexico, zeroing in on the target coordinates provided by lunar reconnaissance. A laser retroreflector on Lunokhod 1 intercepted the pulses back to Earth. The aforementioned Tom Murphy of UC San Diego, the research team that was trying to activate the Lunokhod, said to the press, quote, we saw its position, and we were stunned by the power of the reflection. Lunokhod 1 is clearly. We got about 2,000 photons from Lunokhod 1 on our first try. For almost 40 years of silence, this rover has a lot to say. It could make contact because of 3 retroreflectors placed on the moon by U.S. Apollo astronauts in the 70s. These were initially set to allow laser ranging of the moon's orbit. A 4th reflector was placed by Lunokhod 2, the successor of Lunokhod 1 that landed in 19... Eric Silverberg, a retired veteran of the space race who was arranging activity to the McDonald Observatory during the 60s and the 80s, was astonished when he contacted the Soviet vehicle after 40 years. He said to the press, quote, we successfully arranged all 3 of the Apollo corner reflectors and the Lunokhod 2 reflector. With Lunokhod 1 back in the picture, the U.S. research team could use laser ranging gravity theory. Murphy and his team were trying to, quote, see if we can break it. Einstein's theory of general relativity establishes that the mass and energy in massive object make a space curve. This curving tells the objects around the massive body how to move, makes the Earth and Moon fall toward the Sun. The lunar laser ranging operation will continue further testing in hopes of finding a crack in Einstein's activity. Lunokhod 1 62 in 1973, which drove for approximately 37 kilometers on the lunar surface's range. For 40 years, no other vehicle landed on the moon. It wasn't until 2013 that another robot explored the moon's surface, when the Chang'e 3 and its rover U-2. U could not move after its second lunar night. It remained operational for 31 months, record previously held by the Soviet Lunokhod 2. A top-secret document describing a 1958 United States Air Force program ground base on the moon was redacted right after the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik. The Lunar Expedition Base has its objective manned exploration, first manned landing and return in late 1967. This one achieved before the USSR will serve to demonstrate conclusively that this nation possesses future competition in technology. No space achievement short of this technological significance, historical impact, or excite the entire world. While NASA would eventually develop its own plan to land, as so eloquently stated in President John F. Kennedy's 1962 "We choose to go to the Air Force didn't want to wait for a mere scientific expedition." In quote, strategic high ground, and that meant having a U.S. military station firmly well above its enemies on Earth. Before the Apollo program, the Lunex project was hatched in the late 1950s. The U.S. first crewed mission on the moon, and developed a detailed schedule that would lead to an underground lunar astronauts within a decade. The secret Lunar Air Force's belief that, quote, the Soviets do not differentiate between military and non... They have talked of a peaceful intent of their space program, but there are many pounds of which cannot be accounted for on the basis of data given out. It should be presumed military payloads. From 1958, the Air Force and industrial partners teamed up to examine the different angles of a lunar the first manned landing and return in 1967. Determined that the problem of sending men to the moon and the techniques to achieve this goal were, quote, moreover, the objective was believed to be attainable early and reasonably economical. Soon, the secretive party and a broad technological base was established at the Air Force laboratories. It was not a race against the Russians per se, but primarily a plan to achieve a much-needed... After the launch of Sputnik, industry Air Force teams conducted a series of studies to closely and realize the potential of space operations. The first study was Lunar Observatory, a thorough review of a manned intelligence observatory on the lunar surface. The second research endeavor, called Strategic Lunar System Applications of such facilities. Both studies unequivocally concluded attainable and reliable. A third study, known as Logistic, conceptualized the design of a specialized vehicle for a crew of 3 to enter and consequently carry passengers to and from the natural satellite. This vehicle would be the key item in the transportation system and demanded close attention, its weight, as it would determine the necessary size for the boosters. With the objective to land 3 men on the moon as soon as possible, the third quarter of 1967, with the establishment of a lunar expedition by 1960. As the report concluded, quote, completion of this plan with equipment, materials, and techniques to transport men to and from the lunar and to provide a lunar facility which will allow men to live and work in the extremely harsh lunar. Most important development would be a vehicle capable of transporting crews and supplies satellite. The lunar transport would be composed of a space launching system, either manned or cargo. The manned lunar re-entry vehicle, a launch stage, and a landing stage. The landings composed the cargo payload. It comprised a booster in 3 stages, which could deliver either payload on a lunar escape velocity. Escape velocity was approximately feet per second, enough to boost the 134,000-pound manned payload on a Triton and reach it in 2.5 days. When approaching the moon, horizon scanners to reposition to a vertical relative to the locality. The landing stage would then decelerate it for a smooth landing at the pre-selected site, and a pre-positioned beacon would affect the offset landing. As for launching, the landing stage would serve as a base to impulse the Lunex re-entry vehicle. Unmanned tests would need to be carried out beforehand, down and launching controlled from Earth. Furthermore, minor mid-course re-entry into the atmosphere, such as performing the return trajectory within the available. Otherwise, the vehicle might skip back into space or burn from excess heat. By using aerodynamic braking, the craft could any other unpowered aircraft due to its lift capability. Enough successful completed before rendering the system dependable. Cargo could be transported similarly, but without the lunar launch stage, the equivalent of the Lunex re-entry vehicle and the launch stage combined. The recovery of a manned re-entry vehicle was set for 1965. Milestones were to achieve manned circumlunar flight by 1966, and a complete and return by 1967. The program had $7.5 billion. If the United States had followed up with Lunex instead of Prim, they would have built a launch vehicle resembling the shuttle by the end of the 1960s. In addition, the lifting re-entry vehicle, with its solid rocket boosters and LUX, would likely have provided a more stable basis for succeeding manned programs. NASA's civilian enterprise that was favored over the Air Force's military program. For Apollo, would NASA perform a radical revision of its technique, giving more importance to efficiency in the space shuttle. Lunex would also have a presence in space, even to the extent of changing the course of the Cold War. However, the program was overly optimistic. The booster and more advanced than the Apollos, and the first lunar landing was due soon, delayed in the orbital rendezvous maneuver. Lunex is 35 lifting body spacecraft, capable of re-entering and withstanding lunar hybrids between engine restarts. The compound vehicle would even land in peace, complete with its entire crew. In contrast, the Apollo module, which would leave the command and service modules. The module would then connect with the lunar orbit. Moreover, craft required electrostatic gyro platforms, but these weren't fully perfected until these. In addition, it also demanded computer storage data capability to this day. As was the case with projects that involved manned missions, the outbreak of the Vietnam War likely stretched the service, and it's believed that Lunex was eventually cancelled because of this. No efforts were in vain, as the top-secret report indicated, quote, the intent herein is an integrated program in that later development tests build on the result. Most historians agree that correct in establishing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration as a civilian agency was born. Without it, a military-based space program turned outer space into an open battlefield. While Armstrong took humanity's first steps on the moon, the American Air Force had a wild satellite. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviets themselves as world leaders in scientific, military, and technological prowess. Political conflict dragged on for nearly 5 decades. The Soviets launched Sputnik and Sputnik 2, the first satellites in history, behind in the space race. To get ahead of the communists, the United States assembled scientists, including recent grad school alumni Carl Sagan, the geniuses, to figure out how to blow up the moon. Project A-119 had no real functional purpose. The single goal, especially the Soviets, that the United States could achieve something ambitiously spectacular mushroom cloud. Had the project come to fruition, or have happened, and history as we know it would be drastically different. Demolishing the moon seems unimaginable and downright crazy. All ideas were. In the late 1950s, feelings of paranoia and scientific one-upmanship between the US and its arch-nemesis, the USSR, fronts in the war for global supremacy. On October 4th, 1950, was surprised when news broke that the USSR had successfully launched the world's first-ever satellite. Only a month later, Sputnik 2 was also launched into Earth's orbit. Vince Houghton, the curator of the International Spy Museum, described the moment as such. The Americans and the West were terrified of the concept that, potentially, the Soviets had... We'd always been the big kids in science and technology, the people who invented... All of a sudden, the Soviets had beaten us into space. The ball was in the United States court now. The country needed to reclaim its authority. Its technology was bigger and better than the communists. They needed a symbol, as possible. That same year, Edward Teller, the inventor of the wrote a project about outer space detonations. He proposed detonating at least one and another one near it to test the lunar surface after the eruptions. He wasn't the first scientist to suggest it, and by the end of 1957, there were rumors of it too. A sensationalist piece in the Pittsburgh Press reported the latest rumor going around is that the Russians plan to explode a rocket-borne H-bomb on the moon November 7th. If that's true, look out. The rocket and its cargo are likely then not to boomerang. In 1958, building a team to see if this outlandish plan would be plausible. In the air, the explosion would serve two purposes. One, the blast effects would be met to learn more about the moon than ever before. The other, perhaps even a giant explosive cloud in space, would be visible to the whole world. This served as a show of strength for America. Dr. Leonard Wright was to lead the project. He had already held senior positions at NASA and was a award winner Enrico Fermi, along with other world-renowned scientists. He'd been fascinated by the subject matter, even though the moon wasn't his area of expertise. In an interview with The Observer, he stated, quote, "The Air Force wanted a mushroom cloud so from Earth. The US was lagging behind in the space race. The explosion would upside the moon, and the theory was that if the bomb exploded on the edge of the moon, the mushroom would the sun." To know everything there was to learn about the moon, Pieper, a Dutch astronomer, planetary scientist, and selenographer. Man to be hired was doctorate student Carl Sagan. His job was to accurately model that would be caused by that kind of nuclear explosion on the moon's surface. The big and visible the mushroom cloud would be. Almost a year and a half of 1959, Project A119 was presented to the Air Force in her lunar research flights. The now unclassified, almost 300 pages contemplated all the scientific, military, and political pros and cons of a hyperspace on the moon. According to the report, quote, "A study was used the moon's structure and origin, and a description of the probable nature of the lunar surface. The areas discussed in some detail are lunar optical studies, seismic observations, and magnetic fields, plasma, magnetic field effects, and organic. Bombing the moon had a significant political benefit, which would imprint itself into the entire world's minds, and the Soviet Union would fall behind. Sputnik and its successor would seem like child's play. It isn't exactly clear on how the warhead would make its way to outer space. Or cut out or redacted, not much is known about the specifications a rocket would need to carry a... However, the report does suggest a missile carrier launched from Earth and traveled 238,000 miles to the moon, where it would detonate. Scientists discarded the possibility of a hydrogen bomb, as it would have been too... The conclusion was that an atom bomb would be the better choice, as large as the one used on Hiroshima at the end of World War II. Entirely before it was even formally considered. And although there isn't an official reason scrapped, there is plenty of speculation. Even if the Air Force had done all the math, there's no absolute way of knowing what could happen to Earth should the mission fail. The possibility that bombing the moon would be seen as an act of military violence, rather than a show of science. Fear at the public outrage might have been a powerful reason. As Dr. Rifle said, quote, "It was a PR in the minds of the people from the Air Force." The scientists' concern about reading from the moon could also have been one of the deciding factors in canceling the program and eliminating future missions with space warheads. In the years that followed, different bills that would further limit these kinds of attacks. The first one, the Test Ban Treaty in 1983. The second was the United Nations Outreach 7, which over 100 countries signed. America rose just 10 years later with the iconic Apollo 11 mission. On July 20th, the world watched, astonished, as Neil Armstrong became the first man to ever set foot. Dr. Rifle became the deputy director at NASA for the Apollo program. Graduate Carl Sagan became an American global icon of science with the television shows. A study of lunar research flights was designated as classified information from the public for decades. It wasn't until the mid-90s when biographer of the project while researching for a book about Sagan. The project came in 2000 when the book was published. This led Dr. Rifle to break his anonymity as he gave an interview to The Observer, where he revealed details about America's unusual but didn't specify how the explosion would have taken place. He said, quote, "Made public, there would have been an outcry. There's no 119 been implemented, modern history would be vastly different. The moon, artistic inspiration for people worldwide, and the thought of it not existing is mind-boggling." According to Vince Houghton at the International Spy Museum, the explosion wouldn't even have expected. Due to the lack of atmosphere, instead of a mushroom cloud, a flash of bright light. British nuclear historian Dr. David Lau wrote, "It is obscene to think that the first contact human beings would have been to explode a nuclear bomb. Had they gone ahead, we would image of Neil Armstrong taking one giant step for mankind."